Hi everyone, my name is Kelsey Yates and welcome to my home and my spread. So this project is called Sourdough for the People, which I wanted to start because I wanted everyone to feel empowered and excited about making bread, and if not bread, trying something that gives a gift to you. Through this project, I'm going to break down simply how to make sourdough bread. Feel free to watch the whole video, watch it in little steps, and good luck on your path. So before we get started, another thing I just wanted to talk about is while there are steps and time frames for making sourdough that I will present in this video, these are all just guidelines. Sourdough is a living being, it's a colony actually of yeast and bacteria that you create. So it's on its own schedule as well. And you're gonna develop a relationship with your starter, with your bread. And because it is a living being, it's on its own time. So while I present these timelines and guidance and the steps, always important to watch your bread and make sure it is not, you're not taking it too far, it's not too bubbly and you're over fermenting, and it's not no activity at all and it's completely under fermented. So just a word to the wise, it's a journey of patience. Take your time. You will start to know what is the right path for you and your loaf as you get more familiar with it. To feed your sourdough starter, you take 50 grams of sourdough starter from your jar or whatever you keep your sourdough starter in. Add that to a separate bowl with 50 grams of warm water and 50 grams of whole wheat flour. These fresh ingredients will help activate that existing sourdough starter. So you mix everything together in this separate bowl. You want to place it back in the jar that you keep your sourdough starter in. So you take that jar and basically remove or discard, and this used sourdough starter, no longer needed sourdough starter, is actually called discard. Add that to a separate bowl in order to save it for use in future recipes and make room in your jar for your starter to become activated in. So you take what you just mixed in that bowl and add it back into the jar. As you can see, I've placed a rubber band on this jar, and that basically helps me visually see when the starter doubles, which is one indication that your starter is active and ready for use in making sourdough. And a second way to see if your sourdough starter is ready is to do a float test. So as you can see, I take a little bit of that activated starter and add it to some water. If the starter is floating, it should be ready for use in making sourdough. So in this step, you'll add 350 grams of warm water. I like to use warm water because I find it helps activate the starter, but you want to make sure it's not boiling to not kill it. Then you will add your 100 grams of starter. Then you will kind of mix the starter with your hands or a spoon, just so it's dissolved and evenly distributed throughout the water. So now you will add your flour. In this recipe, we will be using 450 grams of bread flour and 50 grams of whole wheat flour. And this begins the bread making process. So you have your water, your dissolved starter, and your flours together. And I like to start off with a spoon and then kind of get in there with my hands. You really just want to mix until it's like a shaggy ball and all the flours are wet and have parts of the starter in it. At this point, the dough is probably going to be sticky. I like to get in there with my hands and make sure it's all well mixed. And at each step, you're going to want to cover your mixture with a damp, doesn't need to be wet, tea towel or dishcloth. And since this is the first step that we will be taking a break, I like to take the opportunity to refeed my starter. Since we removed 100 grams of that active starter from it, there's about 50 grams of starter back in there. So we're basically just going to add that 50 grams of warm water again, and 50 grams of whole wheat flour to refeed that starter. I generally, after I mix it up, I like to just leave it on the counter off to the side. You don't need to wait another 4 hours for it to double or anything. I like to see a little bit of activation. Then I keep mine back in the fridge since it's a well-established starter. And in this step, we'll be adding the 10 grams of salt. This is done in my recipe after the flour and the water and the bread creation fermentation has started, because salt does kill fermentation, but not that much. We like to give it a little head start before we add the salt, but you'll be adding the 10 grams of salt and then the 20 grams of water just to kind of get that salt dissolved. And from here, basically just mix until you don't feel any more salt granulars on your fingers and it feels well distributed. And I like to kind of get a little slap and fold motion here, not necessary, but I find this helps to some degree to create shapes and layers as we do in the next steps. And again, cover with a wet tea towel at each step. So 30 minutes later, we're going to be starting our layering coil folds, as they're called. So to do this, you basically place your fingers under the mix about halfway through so you're able to place the dough on top of itself. So fold like a coil shape in layers over itself. So you lift about halfway through, pull it so the bread is able to be placed over itself, first at 180 degrees and then turn another 180 degrees and do it that way. Turn another 90 so you get all 4 sides folded. "30 minutes isn't an exact science, but that's a good goalpost to stay by. If life gets in the way, it can totally be extended." Now we will do our second coil fold. You'll find that the bread at this step is starting to take more of a shape on, should be a little easier to work with at every step. And if it's still being hard to work with, make sure you keep your hands wet and have patience. And finally, you will do a third coil fold. At this step, we took the bread out and put it in a glass jar so it's a little easier to see. As you can see, I placed my fingers under, fold it over to make coil shape on top of itself. Do one side, turn it 180 degrees, do that side. Then turn it again 90 degrees and complete it there, the fold on that side. And now begins the shaping process. So after the bread has fermented for a few hours and rested, you want to remove it from the bowl and remove that gently and just kind of guide with your fingers and let gravity help you. And then you will use the bench scraper to create surface tension on what will be the outside, the top of your bread. Basically, you put that bench scraper under and you slide it through to kind of create a nice tight outside of your bread. We move the camera around to show you a better angle of the shaping. So you want to get under that bread and make sure you're creating skin, friction, tension here to get a nice even outside for your bread. And then I like to let the bread rest for about 20 minutes and remove the towel. From there, cover the bread with some flour. You will use your bench scraper to kind of tuck the flour that came over the bread, which you want. Use that bench scraper around the clock use it to help with your other hand to flip the bread over and gently with your fingers kind of guide the bread so there's more of a surface tension to work with, because we're basically going to fold the bread in thirds, hot dog style you can call it, in order to do our final roll into the banneton. So 1/3 flipped there, 2/3 folded there. Use your fingers. Now take that hot dog, turn it into a hamburger or your bread, and roll while pushing it towards yourself in a tucking motion. So take your floured banneton off to the side. With a tucking motion, just kind of flip it into that floured container. Right here, I like to take the opportunity to do the dishes and let it rest for a few minutes before you kind of do that final stitching for the bread. Here, you just want to kind of stitch. This will be the bottom, so again, we don't necessarily care about aesthetics or crusts because it'll be flattened. Tuck along the long edge and kind of fold on the ends to tuck that bread in. Place your bread in the fridge overnight. When I preheat, I like to place my loaf in the freezer. When that's done and you're ready to bake, you take it out of the freezer or the fridge and you place it on some parchment paper. Basically, I don't want that touching the top and the sides of the bread to the extent possible. I flour the bread and I cut the bread, and scoring is just using a razor or a knife to kind of cut an angle through the bread. Kind of gives that nice open look that makes the bread nice and airy and delicious. Then your bread is ready to be placed in the oven, either an open bake method or in a Dutch oven. So this is what's called a 5-minute score. I just kind of get back in there with the score and make sure that ear really pops open. It's not necessary, but I like the way it looks after. So now I'm taking the Dutch oven out of the preheated oven, and we're going to place the bread in there. And I like to add, the jury's out on this on the internet, but I like to add a little ice cubes along the side of it. I'll put the lid back on. And then it goes in the oven. When making sourdough, you are trying to create a dance or the right balance between creating flavor, so fermenting, you're taking that colony of yeast and bacteria, letting it grow, letting it bubble, that's the flavor of the bread, and you're also trying to work to create the right shape of bread. So that's why we do different coil folds, they build strength in the bread. We use the bench scraper to create surface tension. And finally, we cut to let those good layers and all the hard work we put into expand and come out and get to enjoy all these delicious fermented sourdough bubbles in here. Thanks for following along. Best of luck as you go down your path of bread making.